How do you go to the moon? First of all, let's explain the central component that underpins all of rocket science, delta V. Delta V is change in velocity, and it is used as a standard way of comparing how far a ship can travel compared to another ship. A tiny vehicle with lots of delta V could go much further than a larger vehicle with a small amount of delta V, even though the tiny vehicle has less fuel. Fuel works differently in space because, unlike a car, a rocket engine does not need to be turned on to keep moving the vehicle, since there's practically no friction to apply any forces that will oppose the motion, and therefore fuel is not constantly consumed. This is Newton's first law in action. Secondly, let's explain the basic rocket problem. To have a rocket that can get to the moon, you must first have this rocket in orbit around the Earth. To get this rocket in orbit, you need to launch the first rocket with a bigger rocket. This bigger rocket needs to also be launched by a bigger rocket, and that too requires even more power. If the engineers are not careful when designing a rocket, they can end up with an exponentially growing, never-ending plan. The Apollo engineers had more to consider than just this. They also had to design a ship capable of returning back. An original plan, dubbed Project Nova, was a direct ascent vehicle. This means that the spaceship would land on the moon with all the fuel and machinery necessary to get back. Referring to the rocket problem from earlier, engineers realised that the rocket would require an additional fourth stage. Around the same time, Dr. John Houbolt was trying to push forward a concept for getting to the moon to the NASA administration. It was called Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. The idea went against Project Nova by suggesting to split the rocket, leaving the fuel necessary to get back from the moon in orbit, and have a lander drop to the surface with just enough fuel necessary to get back to the main rocket. This would leave the delta V of the large section of the rocket in space, so no delta V would have to be spent bringing this extra fuel down. This concept was blasted due to the safety and practical concerns, but it was eventually elected due to budget constraints. So, assuming all of this has been accounted for, and your astronauts are in orbit around the Earth, what is the most fuel-efficient way to get there? Walter Hohmann, in his book The Accessibility of Celestial Bodies, suggested the easiest way to get from one place to another only requires the spaceship to fire its engines twice. How could this be possible? Firstly, fire the engines in the direction your spaceship is orbiting in. This direction is called prograde. Keep the engines on until the highest point in your orbit, the apoapsis, just touches the orbit of the body you're trying to get to. Then, turn the engine off, and wait. The second burn takes place at the new apoapsis, pointing prograde once again. Keep the engine firing until the lowest point of your orbit, the periapsis, also extends to the target height. Turn the engine off and you have successfully changed your orbit. This method is still employed today in almost every rocket flight, because it is quick and usually the most efficient in delta V expenditure. I say usually because there are special cases where another type of transfer can be more efficient in terms of delta V. R. E. Sternfeld in 1934 proposed a radically different method that suggested a spaceship extend its apoapsis far past the target orbit, then at this new apoapsis raise the periapsis to the required target height. To the lower apoapsis or periapsis, you must burn in the opposite direction of travel called retrograde. This is applied at the new periapsis so that the apoapsis is brought down to the new target height. One would assume this only expends more fuel, but there is some very clever physics behind this. The further away a ship is from an orbiting body, the slower it needs to travel in order to stay in orbit, and vice versa. The Bi-Elliptic transfer makes use of the fact that far away from the Earth the ship would be travelling at such a small speed that any delta V applied changes the periapsis more than if the ship was closer to the Earth. The first and third burns are similar in expenditure to the Hohmann transfer, and in some cases are slightly less. Whilst the Bi-Elliptic transfer is generally more efficient, the huge travel time it takes complicates the design of the ship. To send up a vehicle with all the supplies necessary to keep your astronauts up there for the increased length of time negates the cost of the delta V for the Hohmann transfer. So, now your astronauts have got to the moon, landing is much simpler to figure out. If you burn retrograde enough, your periapsis will intersect with the ground, and your ship is no longer in orbit. Whilst travelling on your new suborbital trajectory, you must progressively burn retrograde to bleed off all the orbital velocity you have, until you are no longer going around the planet, and are falling straight down. The most efficient way of doing this is to ensure the moment you have bled off the sideways velocity is the same moment you have reached the ground. To get back, of course, you must run the whole process in reverse. That's how you get to the moon. Thanks for watching.